Take two. Okay. Okay. So as I was mentioning for Parshas Chaya Sarah, that some of the Meforshim tell us that the most valuable lessons that we get is to learn how we're supposed to interact with the other nations that are around us. We know that Avraham's life was all about learning how to interact with the other nations, and also not only interacting with them on a healthy way and making a Kiddush Hashem, but also note that there are certain episodes where we don't necessarily teach the other nations, but we can also learn from the other nations. Part of Avraham's formative years were not only gaining negative lessons of being pursued, but also gaining positive lessons from learning about certain values and certain ways of life that were common to the people among whom he was living in Eretz Yisrael. So for example, going back to Parshas Lech Lecha, Avraham has an interaction with Malki Tzedek after the War of the Four Kings. And one of the things that Avraham learned from Malki Tzedek was the principle of tithing. Right? Because what does it say? Vayitin lo ma'aser mikol. That he gives Avraham a tithe. And tithing, you're supposed to tithe to the priest. That Avraham, learns about tithing, and that would be passed on to his descendants. In Parshas Vayera, Avraham has an interaction with Avimelech, teaching him about the importance of making treaties and avoiding conflict with your neighbors, and which was apparently a traditional Philistine practice, which is why Avimelech wanted to make a treaty. What can we learn, and what was Avraham supposed to gain from his interaction with the Hittite people from whom he was trying to purchase the Machpelah territory in Hebron? And I think that if you take a look at something very interesting, there's a Gemara in Bava Batra that says as follows. It's based on the pasuk that after Avraham acquires the field from Ephron, the Torah tells us in source number 1, this is from chapter 23, pasuk Yud Zayin. It says, Vayakom Sedei Ephron asher b'Machpelah, that the field of Ephron was acquired, that was in the Machpelah, in the doubled cave area, asher lifnei Mamre, that was in front of Mamre, the Mamre territory, Hasadeh v'hamerara asher bo, the field, and the cave that was located on that field, v'chol ha'etz asher basadeh, and all of the trees that were in the field, asher b'chol gevulo saviv, that were on all, that the trees, it seems, were in all of the surrounding boundaries. In other words, when you went onto that field, you noticed that the field was bounded by trees, and that this acted as a natural marker to delineate the borders of the field. And the Torah is making a specific point in telling me that Avraham acquired not only the field, but he acquired the Machpelah, which is the cave that was on the field, and he also acquired the trees that formed the natural boundary around the entire field. Now, is that really important for us to know about the trees? So that leads the Gemara to state as follows. Amar Rav Misharshia, Rav Misharshia states, Mikan lemitzarim min haTorah. From here we learn that borders are a Torah principle. From here we learn that borders are a Torah principle. That's a very vague statement, wouldn't you say? Doesn't mean that borders are a Torah principle. The Rashbam, who's the Rashi commentary on Maseches Bava Basra, says as follows. He says, Shahakonet hasadeh kana et hamitzarim atzman. He says, what the Gemara really means to teach is that when you purchase a field, you purchase the boundary lines of that field as well. V'chol ha'ilanot hanetuyin b'meitzar. And you also acquire all the trees that are dotting the boundaries of that property. D'mitzarim bichlal sadeh. And therefore what the Gemara is conveying to us is that the border, that actual border line, is part of the acquisition. Dahachi mashma saviv kol ha'ilanot hanetuyin bekarka ha'meitzar shu saviv hasadeh. Because that's what the pasuk is conveying to us, that not only did Avraham acquire the field within the border lines of the purchase, but he acquired the border line itself. And that border line was delineated by those trees, which the Torah says that Avraham acquired. Kana Avraham kenir ebenai, that's what it seems to me. But it's still a little bit problematic, because, okay, I mean, if that's really what It's a pretty technical halacha that the Torah is communicating to us. When you purchase a piece of property, and the seller is spinning off a piece of property that he's selling. Let's say he's selling off a quarter of his property, and he gives you a delineation of the borders. Realize that the border line itself, which is a very small strip, maybe of just an inch or even a centimeter or so, is represented as part of the sale that you're entitled to as the buyer. But that seems to be a pretty trivial idea, even though for technical reasons it may have technical applications in the laws of commerce. But why does the Torah need to teach me that very technical law specifically here in the life of Avraham? Let's take a look at the Medrash. The Medrash says, this is Medrash Rabbi, Nun Ches Ches, Hasadeh v'hame'ara asher bo. He acquired the field and the caves and the trees. Amar Rabbi, minayin taninan hamocher tzadehu tzarich lichtov et tzadehu vet simaneha. From where do we know that when you sell a field, you have to actually delineate carefully in the bill of sale not only the name of the field, but also all of the borders, the border markers of the field? In other words, you have to be very specific in delineating the field. Where do we learn that from? Mehacha, we learn it from here. Hasadeh v'hame'ara asher bo, as it says, the field and the cave, v'chol ha'etz asher basdeh, and all of the trees on the field, asher b'chol givulo saviv, that dotted the surrounding areas on the border. Le'Avraham le'mikna le'inei v'nei chet. It was acquired to Avraham as a purchase in the eyes of all of the Hittites. And then Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar is quoted as saying, Kama diyot mishtabchot, Kama kul musim mishtabrim. He says, look how much ink has been spilled, and look how many quills have been broken, kidei lichtov b'nei chet. That this story of Avraham and Ephraim, the words b'nei chet, that this was done in the presence of the sons of Chet, or the Hittites, is written multiple times. He says, Asara pe'amim ksiv b'nei ches, b'nei ches. He says, why is it that if you go through the whole story of Avram's purchase of Maras HaMachpelah, you find the words b'nei ches written a total of 10 times in the story? So we know that they're there. Why do they have to be repeated so many times, asks the Midrash. Answers the Midrash, Asara keneged aseret hadibrot, to correspond to the 10 Commandments. L'lamedcha, to teach you. Shekol mi shehu mevarer mekcho shel tzadik, that anyone who clarifies the sale of a tzaddik, in other words, their presence was there to help clarify exactly what he was buying, and therefore they are rewarded by having their name spelled 10 times because they clarified the sale that was given to a righteous man. Ki'ilu mikayem aseres hadiros. It's therefore as if they are as important as if they had actually fulfilled all 10 commandments of the Torah. How important it is to help a tzaddik get clear delineation in what he acquires, and if you do so, you get the credit of having fulfilled the 10 commandments. So that also needs a little bit of clarification. There are so many things that you can do to help a tzaddik. Why specifically does it have to be with the clarification of his sale? In other words, what is being communicated here on a deeper level? We're going to try and put this all together. So first of all, let's understand this whole idea of mikan lemitzarim min haTorah, that from here we learn about boundaries from the Torah. And as the Rashbam had explained, that when you purchase a field, you acquire the borderline as well. The Medrash tells us that there is a clear delineation, and that when you write the purchase or the sale of a field, you have to delineate very carefully the borders. What does this have to do? What was the larger lesson that Avraham was acquiring, that which he could pass on to his future descendants? After all, the Torah could have written this somewhere in Parshas Mishpatim. Why is it part of the life of Avraham Avinu? And I think that perhaps this is one of the things that Avraham was able to glean from living with the Hittites. And it was something that he would not have been able to learn on his own. Let's think about who Avraham was and what he represented. If you came over to Avraham's house and you asked him to borrow a cup of sugar, what do you think he would say?
Sarah, get the sugar.
Pass the sugar. Pass the honey. Pass the pork pig. Right? That's the old joke, right? That's what my kids always joke about. So he would say, sorry, get the sugar. But he would say, you know what he would say? He'd say, here's the cup of sugar.
You need some flour.
You need some flour. So you would say, well, when should I bring it back? He would say, bring it back, I don't know, whenever you want to bring it back, you bring it back. I don't care. It's mi casa is su casa. Everything that I have, you're welcome to. So the midah of chesed is a beautiful attribute to have. There's only one problem. If mi casa is always su casa, shali shalach, right, what is mine is yours, then it's very difficult to get boundaries, very difficult to create delineations. And there's actually, I read an amazing article that was written many years ago, in 1953. A rabbinic scholar named Manfred Lehman wrote an essay called Abraham's Purchase of Machpelah and Hittite Law. It was published in a scholarly journal called the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research in 1953. And it shows how the biblical account of the Hittites' behavior is perfectly consistent with what we know from the Hittite Code. What is the Hittite Code? It was a code that archaeologists had found sometime in the either 19th or 20th century in Asia Minor that describes Hittite law in the ancient world going back to the year 1200 before the Common Era. And there are two important points that can be found in this codex that Lehman documents that are directly related to our story. And the first thing that he documents is that the Hittites were feudal in their land ownership. Now what that means is that there was a king of the Hittites, and he allowed independent landowners. If you wanted to own land, no problem. But you acquired the land from the government, you paid for the property, and in exchange of being able to have a piece of property from the government, you had to provide the government either with service or tax as a result of being allowed to own the property. And the Hittite code is clear that if someone sells all his property and he wants to divest all of his properties, he's now exempt from having any feudal responsibilities to the king of the Hittites. And all of these responsibilities are passed over to the buyer. So now it becomes the headache of the buyer of the property to pay the tax or to bring service to the king. But that's only if you sell all your property. If you sell only a portion of your property, let's say I own 10 acres, and I sell off 5 acres, so then both the buyer has to pay the tax to the king, and I have to continue to pay tax to the king. I'm still under feudal servitude to the king because I still own property. So Lehman says like this. He says, if you look at the story that way, let's look at the psukim at the beginning of the story. What was Avraham's goal when he first came to the Hittites in order to purchase property? Was he interested in purchasing a big piece of property, Avraham? No, he was just interested in purchasing a burial site. All he really wanted to purchase was the Ma'aras HaMachpelah. If you take a look, he says, V'yiten li, in Pasuk Tes, in source number 5, he says, V'yiten li es Ma'aras HaMachpelah asher lo asher b'ktzei sadehu. All I want to purchase is the Machpelah cave that's in the corner of his field. B'chesef malei yitanena li b'sochachem la'achuzas kaver. I'll pay whatever the full price. I want to pay full price. I just need a place to bury my wife. If you skip to Pasuk Yud Aleph, what is Ephron's insistence? Lo Adoni Shema'eni. No, my master, listen to me. Hasadeh nasati lach v'hame'ara asher bo lechanesati. I'm not just going to sell you the cave. I'm going to sell you the entire kit and caboodle. I'm going to sell you the field and the cave. Why? Why is this important information? Was Ephron merely being generous? Well, we know he wasn't a generous guy because Chazal tell us that he charged Avraham an exorbitant fee for the sale of his property. So what was his motivation for selling off both the cave and the field? If anything, the cave was pretty worthless, and it was the field that could be used for agricultural purposes. His reason was, according to Lehman, was because of this part of the Hittite code. is that Ephron said, I want out of Hittite real estate ownership. If I'm going to sell, I want to sell so that I have no more feudal responsibilities to the Hittite king. So therefore, I'm not just going to sell you the cave. You've got to buy the whole thing so I can divest my real estate holdings from the Hittite land. I don't want to have any more responsibilities and I don't want any more taxes. So that's lesson number one that Lehman gets out of this Hittite code. The second thing is, and I'm just quoting from his article, he says, as is well known, a characteristic trait in Hittite business documents is the consistent listing of the exact number of trees at each real estate sale. And I think, right, when you consider why Avraham had to go through this experience with the Bnei Ches, is because without this lesson from Bnei Ches, Avraham would have just been all over the place. Avraham would have come, as he did, and he said, look, I'm just looking for a place to bear my wife Sarah. And if he would have gone to anyone else, then the deal would have been, okay, you want a property? All right, here's a property. What do you want to pay for it? Here, Avraham said, take the money. It's yours. Whatever you ask me for it. Money's not important to me. Whatever you want, whatever you're asking, just take it. Now, you get to the time of being able to bury Sarah. And then, of course, the heirs of the seller would come along and say, wait 1 second, not so fast. Who said that you're allowed to go on this part of the burial site? And where did you get the permission to go this far? Our father maybe only show us the document. And Avraham says, I don't have a document. We did it on a handshake. That's the way Avraham was used to doing business, because he was the Baal Chesed. The Bnei Ches were extremely punctilious in their transactions. And that was the one thing that Avraham himself did not possess, because he felt, shali shalach, whatever you want, have the cup of sugar, have the cup of flour, whatever you want to take, is you can take. And that's why the Medrash says that the Bnei Ches are remembered for the good, because they helped Avraham develop a trait that he didn't possess on his own. Remember, every one of the 10 tests that was given to Avraham was a test to try and produce from within him, or try to cultivate from within Avraham a trait that did not come naturally to him. Business transactions did not come naturally to Avraham Avinu, because he wanted to share whatever he had with everybody else. And he didn't worry about, he did everything on a handshake, and he didn't worry about the specifics. And there's obviously this ideal of to be ma'avir al midosav, to be very forgiving, say, yeah, it's okay, go ahead, it's yours. However, what is Avraham now doing at this stage in his life? He's burying his wife, and he's about to pass the baton of leadership over to his son Yitzchak. And in order to do that, in order to perpetuate the Jewish people, we have to be very, very careful about creating boundaries. Because one of the greatest pitfalls that has occurred to the Jewish people throughout history is when there is not a clear delineation of our boundaries. Just look at the life of Yitzchak and the life of Yaakov. We're going to be reading about, in next week's parsha, the life of Yitzchak. And Yitzchak's greatest persecution in life is from the Philistines, with whom Avraham had a lot of dealings, but they did a lot of business transactions on a handshake. So Avraham had a number of wells that he dug in Philistine territory. And now that Avraham has passed away, and Yitzchak has to continue his legacy, and he wants to be able to use those wells, come along the Philistines and say, not so fast. Show us the bill of sale. And what does Yitzchak say? I don't have a bill of sale. My father and your father Avimelech did everything on a handshake. They trusted each other. No. Doesn't work that way anymore. And Yitzchak therefore has to develop what his father now has already started with Bnei Ches, which is that sense of Gevura, Din, the strict letter of the law, because that's what Judaism requires as well. As much as we want to be forgiving and sharing and nice, we have to also realize that when we interact with people in the world, there have to be careful delineation of boundaries. And this is true in business, And it's true in the delineation of real estate, and it's true in relationships as well. Now look at Lavan. We're going to go now to Yitzchak's son, Yaakov. And how is he going to be prepared to deal with a trickster who's going to try every single rule in the book to be able to overturn Yaakov's legal rights? And unless Yaakov has a clear understanding of how to maneuver and outmaneuver Lavan, he has no hope. So this is the beginning of that whole process of the Jewish people learning how to survive in in shark-infested waters of where the world is out to try and take away things that we are entitled to. And let's go to, and by the way, that's why we owe a great debt of gratitude to the Bnei Ches. The Bnei Ches taught Avraham the trait, trust no one. Make sure you get everything in writing. It's what my father's always taught me. My father's a lawyer. He says, you make a deal with someone, don't rely on the handshake. Trust no one, because at some point, either tomorrow or years from now, someone's going to question the arrangement or the agreement that was made. You should always have your paperwork with careful delineation of where and what and how much and who's entitled to what. And this is true in human relationships as well. One of the great sources of aggravation in young couples' marriages is not the clear delineation of boundaries, right? When you don't create proper boundaries in relationships, there's obviously a desire that you want to be able to welcome your parents into your home at all times, welcome your children into your home at all times. Sometimes the creation of healthy boundaries creates healthy relationships. And if there are no boundaries in relationships, then eventually things will begin to break down. And let's bring it to the modern era. What is the source of the greatest contention within the modern state of Israel today? The lack of clarity on proper borders. Until those borders will be clearly delineated. It's the one tragic mistake that if we wanted to look at in retrospect as to what was done incorrectly from a strategic position when after 1948 and after 1967, there was not enough of an insistence on the placement of permanent borders for the state of Israel. And this has resulted in a perpetual thorn in the side of the people of Israel to this very day. It's why we're suffering to this day. It's because the borders were not clearly delineated. So you can look at it on a national level, but you can also look at it on a very, very personal level, both in the transactions that we make in life and also the relationships that we forge in life, especially when it comes to people that we love. Sometimes it's necessary, and probably most times it's necessary, to delineate very, very carefully the boundaries and limits of those relationships so that we're able to have healthy relationships for our future. So hopefully if we fulfill the rules of boundaries, mikan lemitzarim min haTorah, you see from here that making boundaries is a Torah principle. And it's not something that's anti-Torah. Despite the fact that you want to be nice and you want to be giving, create those boundaries. And by creating boundaries, we'll receive rewards that are boundless. Have a great day, everybody.